We meet again, Alex, and we're going to round off volume 2 now on our never-ending journey, but this is just a staging post.
Yes, yes. Incredible already towards the end of volume
Thank
2.
you.
And today we're going to talk about the diversity and the harmony of the different
Yes,
traditions
yes,
in
exactly.
describing the constitution of man, isn't it?
Exactly so, in describing the constitution of man. The whole idea is to show the tremendous unity that exists, not by imagining it, but by really providing the evidence.
And it is a goal of this chapter once more to reinforce
Mm,
what's known about such a composition.
mm,
I'm speaking as perhaps a naive or innocent reader. I was surprised to encounter again now from all these different angles
mm.
the descriptions about the constitution. So I realized, and that's obvious to you, but it wasn't to me, and maybe it's not for our viewers and your readers, that this is a central topic of the entire volume 2. The constitution of man is perhaps the most important teaching you want to come across in volume 2.
Yes, it is. Volume 2, the most important point I want to get across is that man is really a radiation of the universal oversoul, if you like, or a radiation from divinity, let's put it in simple terms. And therefore, by understanding who we truly are, logically, we understand our fellow beings. I mean, what could be simpler or simpler logic, I would say, yeah.
Yes, and also because my job is to make naive questions.
No, no.
I was wondering why. No, I don't mind. I actually enjoy it. So why is it so important to emphasize that? And well, in a way, you just answer it by saying, well, one of the key questions, existential questions that never gets fully answered, but it has to be there, is who are we? Who am I?
Mm.
So that's why I suppose you spend so much effort in volume 2 trying to convey to us the great efforts and intuitions of all these traditions into answering the core, if you wish, organization of who are we.
Yes, into answering that question insofar as one ever can answer it. But of course, I think we all agree that words will never convey the full facts. Words are only signposts. The old saying, the finger pointing at the moon, you can't keep looking at the finger. But
Yes.
very few of us can look at the moon without a finger pointing to it. The great sages can. So we need help in that direction and help from various fingers because depending on where you are, your culture, your language, your makeup, you need a different pointer from my neighbor.
Yeah, indeed. I like the metaphor
Hence
very
these
much.
different traditions.
Yes, and you're directing, another thing you're doing is you're directing our attention.
Mm.
And as we know also from the work of Ian McGilchrist, attention is not just one more cognitive function. Paying attention changes everything, and including the world, not just
Yeah.
ourselves. So that
Yes.
pointer is absolutely key.
Yes, and attention is something that's being eroded, in my opinion, in general in our society with social media and distractions and all that goes around and is coming our way. Our quality of attention is being threatened, and that's the most precious thing to recover.
Indeed. Okay, so this chapter is structured in 3 parts, right?
Mhm.
One, you
Yes,
concentrate on theosophy again, the
yes,
theosophical tradition,
yes,
and then you
yes,
mention Eastern and Western to
yes.
again show that despite, I must say, this was a difficult chapter because
Of course.
it requires that you really know the previous ones, because then you're discussing, well, they call it this, but then somebody else called it that, but it meant the same with a slight change. But nevertheless, we can see all these arrows pointing in the same direction with a little bit of a fight over terms and classifications,
Of course.
which you also let it be transparent to the
Mm,
reader.
sure. That's well put, Alex. A little bit of a fight, a little bit of divergence always stimulates further inquiry. Yes, yeah, and not ever ignoring the modern teachings from Ken Wilber, Sri Aurobindo, Rudolf Steiner as well. I've included that in the Western section.
Yes. How do you want to proceed? Because perhaps we can try to go a bit sequentially and at least mention some of the names, the key names, and maybe something about what they brought to the table after the previous one.
Yeah. Should we just start then with with classical theosophy, bearing in mind that theosophy is not Madame Blavatsky or anyone's invention, but the society was founded in 1875, and the key purpose was that between religious superstition and brutal scientific materialism, the white dove of truth doesn't know where to place her weary foot. I'm paraphrasing that famous saying. So the society brought together these key teachings to show that when you examine any one of those and take it further back, you see it comes from one source from which all the other great streams of science, religion, and philosophy have emanated. Now, in 1875, it was almost taken for granted. The white man is superior. So that was the age we were living in. I mean, it sounds dreadful now. To think that in England, slight divergence, the former president of the Royal Society, the world's greatest scientific body, Sir Venki Ramakrishna, an Indian from Chennai, the present prime minister is an Indian. Just think how much things have changed, in my opinion, very much so for the better. So the white man is no longer superior, but in those days, the language and the way the teachings were phrased had to take cognizance of that fact. So no words in Sanskrit could be translated in their exact English equivalents, and there had to be a progression of nuances of meaning. So classical theosophy, the great work of Blavatsky and the masters, then the next generation of theosophists from Annie Besant and Taimni and all the other great luminaries, and then people who followed in that train.
What would you say happened? You're right, there's a refinement, but there's also a simplification going on.
Yes, most certainly, yes.
So what's kind of the process that's taking place with all these terms and concepts and principles? How would you describe? Is it that Blavatsky started too deep, perhaps, and that needed to be brought onto a more palatable way?
Yes, you're right. She herself said that some of the literature was put together very hastily, and she wanted it to be simplified and put in a more palatable form. And this is the great work that Annie Besant did. But as always, Alex, in all movements that start off talking about brotherhood and friendship and all the rest of it, you get pockets of opinion, and you get people taking sides, and you get all of this is greater than that, and this is not original. And people, I've got to realize that all of these teachings and words are maps. They're not the territory. So when people confuse the map with the territory, that's when the problem starts.
Let me ask you here something again from my naivete.
Sure.
Those figures, Blavatsky, Besant, Leadbeater, and so on, I suppose they were highly evolved spiritually, weren't they?
Most certainly, yes.
And yet there was friction and struggle, or that was more their own followers? I mean, that surprised me a lot, especially when when we move from, let's say, orthodox science to more spiritual endeavors, to discover that what's going on there, it's also very ego-driven most of the time. So
Yes,
what's your
is.
assessment of the situation there?
Well said, Àlex. Even in the world of music and opera, the friction between the prima donnas was never started by prima donnas. It's their followers who started it. I mean, that's music is a different subject, but the underlying problem is one. It's the followers who take up camps, and then there's a war between the two camps instead of realizing both camps have come from one source.
Yes.
And with something as utterly subtle as the principles of man, you can't possibly throw hard and fast dividing rules and say, well, you know, the etheric double should be above prana, or prana should come first. You have to ask, if you're going to put one above the other, what is the question you're asking? If you're standing on your feet, you know, the ceiling's up there. If I'm standing on my head, the ceiling looks different, even though it's in the same place.
Yes. And for those who haven't read it yet, perhaps you could give an instance of some of the quarrels there, because they're quite specific, but because perhaps our listeners don't know what we're talking about because they haven't read it yet.
Right. Well, the quarrels were really to do with how you order the seven principles. Whether you we always start with the body, but whether the first one after the body should be the linga sharira or the etheric double, and then prana, or whether prana should be excluded as a principle because, as Annie Besant said, it is a universal principle in nature, and we only specialize it in our constitution, and the life unit is called jiva. So however you cut the cake, so to speak, you see that the cross-section is the way you've cut the cake. So the way you ask the question, you get the answer you want. And what Annie Besant showed was the various subtle bodies in their aggregate form what we call the aura of the human being. And this aura is that which extends beyond the physical body, of course, and it's composed of the overlapping portions of these various subtle bodies. The other confusion is caused by people not clearly stating whether they're talking or describing from the standpoint of the active principle or its vehicle. In other words, spirit or matter in very general terms, but whether we're talking of the planes of nature or the fields, the physical body, the emotional body, the mental body, the intuitional body, the causal body, or whether we're talking of that which animates those bodies. We spoke last time about the active principle correlated with its passive medium of expression. So that also has caused a fair bit of confusion.
Now, you also mentioned Alice Bailey and then the kind of the New Age ramifications, and I smiled when I read that because the only or the very little I knew about perennial philosophy came precisely from
Alice Bailey.
Yes, from Alice Bailey, and also it reminded me, and I think that's also an important feature to stress here, that there's a humanitarian mission to all of this, because sometimes it may look like, well, this sort of scholars debating about, but no, this notion of universal brotherhood and which is so necessary and so beautiful. It's always there behind what's discussed.
That is vital what you've said, and if you've picked that up, Àlex, I would say you've picked up the whole raison d'etre of all these teachings, and I mean that most sincerely, because when I paraphrased, I quoted the adept saying between religious superstition and scientific materialism, the white dove of truth doesn't know where to place her foot. Now, how do we show where the white dove of truth can place her foot? Only by revealing a portion, is only a portion, I stress, of the deep esoteric teachings, but the same letter emphasizes that the whole idea of revealing these teachings is not to create a hall of occultism. It's not to create an academy of occultism, but it is to really inculcate a regenerating brotherhood. And brotherhood means men and women, of course, in those days. So how do we inculcate that brotherhood other than by showing that these original teachings in their purity, which are necessarily occult in their nature, have come from this one divine source? And if we show that this one divine source as the fountainhead of these teachings is really the radiating principle of man, there can only be brotherhood. But the fundamental purpose of the Theosophical Society was the brotherhood, not to reveal occult teachings. Yes. And indeed, Blavatsky, in her great humility, actually said that as an abstract body, I put this in the appendix, the Theosophical Society has no teaching and it has nothing to teach. Now, that sounds surprising if you've written, huge books. What's it saying? That there is no thou shalt follow this as a commandment. It's saying, here is the map, here are the teachings. Now you, Mr. Reader, or Mrs. Reader, or whatever, go into it, contemplate, work on it, and make of it what you will.
Yes, as you were saying at the beginning, it's the pointer, right? It's not the goal, it's the means.
It is the means
towards something else.
Yeah.
Now, within these means, because we have the doctrine in the good sense, and then this ultimate purpose, I was also wondering, and perhaps one realizes that the moment one goes into those sources and tries to embody them. But what about the techniques? What's the practice? What's the practice associated with this? Because so far it hasn't been so apparent, at least to me. What does one do with it?
Yes. The 3 pointers. How does one learn anything? There are 3 ways of knowing. We come back to 3. There is enlightened knowledge, that buddhimanas, the intuition, united with the higher mind, if you like, illuminated intellect. So there's enlightened knowledge. There is book knowledge, if you like, or intellect per se. And there's knowledge driven by desire. And that is the problem with a lot of our knowledge, that it's driven by our desire to find out what we want to see, what we want to find out, and to ignore what we don't like. So I wouldn't say that's a technique, but that is a little signpost as to how one should approach any book. How are you reading this book? And this is where poetry and literature have so much to contribute, the mystical poetry.
I see. So would you say by dwelling on these teachings, what may happen is that your orientation to knowledge gets pushed up from desire to intellect, and if grace takes place from intellect to enlightenment? Yes,
grace is a very important word. It's a very important word. I'll never forget a scientific medical network meeting a long time ago in Winchester, when we met at Winchester College. And one of the lecturers, I forget his name, or speakers, he was talking of functional MRI, fMRI, a very erudite talk. And he was, because he knew the audience, he was not afraid to allude to divinity and higher influences. And someone from the audience asked him, look, if you could ask God, so to speak, for just one bit of guidance, what would you ask for? He said, grace. Grace is one of those absolutely elusive qualities that strikes one like a flash.
Yeah.
You can't ask for it. You can't be greedy and say, hey, grace, forget it. You can only make yourself grace prone, or as someone said, enlightenment prone to it. So you read the teachings, you choose a time when you're least distracted, of course, and you try and see, this is important, the wider picture without getting stuck in all sorts of details and getting trapped in sort of intellectual gymnastics, so to speak. See the wider picture. And then, like a seed, it does grow in one, I promise you. And you take it up again, and you'll understand what was puzzling at one time.
Wonderful. Now, back to those names of relevant figures you describe in this section, talking about the theosophical tradition. I was also surprised to learn that quite a few of them were simultaneously scientists, chemists, and so on.
That is vital. And it is vital because it is showing that these teachings are not airy-fairy ideas of people who dream under the moon. I'm very glad you mentioned that. Dr. Taimni is one. He was one of the greatest. Subbarao was an advocate. P.T. Parvari was a professor. I'd say the majority were scientists or qualified in the humanities. Annie Besant was one of the first women, if I'm not mistaken, to get a degree in chemistry from London University.
Wow.
Don't quote me, but I believe that is right, yes. So, yes, they were scientists, and they were, again, trying to move science to a spiritual outlook.
And if I recall...
Course, post those great names, the science group of the Theosophical Society had some luminaries in their ranks. The science group met for 60 years and produced 7 volumes, literally that large, all carefully typewritten. And it's a tragedy, I think, that more of it isn't known. If I mention some of the leading scientists, the first one was Lester Smith, who was a fellow of the Royal Society, he discovered vitamin B12. The other one was Peter Leggett, Vice Chancellor of Surrey University, Fellow of Trinity College, Fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society, and a pioneer of the Scientific and Medical Network. The other one was Arthur Ellison, professor at City University, visiting professor at Massachusetts Institute, thrice president of the Society for Psychical Research. So scientists have figured strongly in the Theosophical Society. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, Àlex.
And I'm so glad you mentioned these continuous meeting and working. This is so remarkable, even for today, where we don't tend to go too much depth, nor to do it for so long, right? We may have one meeting, maybe 2 or 3 meetings, but for 60 years to just concentrate on something. That sounds like yoga, right? It's like a sadhana there.
It's like a jnana yoga.
Yes.
Like a jnana yoga.
And you also mentioned, if I recall correctly, that even the very notion of dimensions to try to explain all these concepts came or was also articulated by theosophists perhaps even before that it became certainly mainstream amongst physicists.
Yes, we spoke last time about what they call planes. We now would say fields. The modern term in physics is fields, where a field is a sphere of influence that radiates beyond the entity that produced the influence. So our magnet could be an inch long, but its field of influence is obviously far more. But planes also refers to levels of the universe, levels of reality, levels of space and time, different levels of space and time. And here, spirit need the most widely used term, spirit, of course, the Atma in one, can't contact the physical level directly. It needs clothing, it needs garments. And those garments are at various levels. Now, how are those garments woven? They're woven from the space and time at those levels. Bernard Carr's president of the SMN, Scientific Medical, his great subject is dimensions, high dimensions of space. Goethe, he put it so beautifully, talking of garments. What did he say? At the roaring loom of time, I ply and weave for God the garment thou know him by. So the weaving, the garment, is space and time.
Yes.
At different levels.
Mm-hmm.
For spirit not to appear naked, other than to itself.
Lovely metaphors. Try to conceive that. Yes. In this list of illustrious figures, we also find Rudolf Steiner.
Oh, most certainly, and rightly so. And rightly
wow.
so. Yeah.
Wow. Because not only the due recognition he deserves, but also the productive aspect of his vision, right? In agriculture, architecture, education, music, movement.
Drama.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
Steiner provided a tremendous uplift to the occult science, and he came from the theosophical stable, so to speak, before he formed the Anthroposophical Society. And his contribution to health and agriculture, I think, is absolutely seminal.
Yes. We had the pleasure to bring our daughters to a Steiner school, and when you see the many facets of his work expressed there, from higher above to so concrete aspects of education, it's unbelievable. What a range.
I believe one of his teachings, correct me if I'm wrong, but is to enhance the creativity of the child before you start to work on their intellectual mind. I think it's very important for the child to be as creative as possible. The intellectual mind can come later.
Yes.
And who was it other than the great Einstein who said, if you want your children to be clever or intelligent, read them fairy stories. If you want them to be even cleverer, read them more fairy stories. These great people all understood it. They all understood it. Einstein was a great mystic, of course, in his way. He understood the limitations of intellect. I mean, if you would argue about Einstein's intellect, but he understood its place and its limitations.
Yes.
The Steiner school, the Montessori school, the Krishnamurti schools, they are very broadly working on the inner child.
And just as a footnote here, because this will come when we discuss the coda of the volume 2, hopefully today, just as a footnote, if you pay attention to the unfolding of a human, then you realize that and if you know all these aspects and levels and planes of the constitution of man, and I think that's, of course, what Steiner knew, then you realize what stations or places you shall try to activate first and others can wait. There's a whole order in time. And we don't tend to think like this because we think we're adults and we're kind of in a steady state. But in kids, it's obviously not the case. There's an unfolding and what's right now and what should wait. And this is, as I see, what Waldorf schools paying a lot of attention to, because they know, I suppose, these occult teachings and they put them in practice.
Yes, they do indeed. And Happy the child, if I can possibly talk about myself, who recognizes this. I don't think I really read a book till I was 13. I mean, of course, I had to read books at school, but my playtime, we didn't have all of this electronic stuff. I was making houses out of cards. I was playing with Meccano, with Baco. I was making things because I wanted to make things with my hands. Reading can come later. It certainly did, but it wasn't forced on me.
Yeah, indeed. Yes. Time plays a role, and let's let it play it.
Yeah.
Okay, then you move from, after explaining or at least giving us a glimpse of all these different figures in theosophy, then you move to Eastern and Western traditions.
Yes, that's right.
Again, impossible to cover in a section of a chapter, let alone in many books. But nevertheless, you speak about Buddhism and Vedanta, and also about
the Zoroastrian teachings.
Yes,
of course. Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. And I have a table that summarizes all the Greek teachings, Plato, Anaxagoras, and Plutarch.
Yes.
Yeah.
And let's insist here that this chapter is, you said it fully and very well illustrated. You may have put a lot of effort in all those tables and colors.
Oh, definitely.
So here you're really thinking. Yes, you're thinking really about the dear reader to make our work easier in capturing, summarizing, synthesizing, organizing all of those notions.
And every table, importantly, starts with a baseline. So it's impossible to compare unless you know what you're comparing against. So every table has the baseline of the occult teaching and then all the other teachings against it. So we can see the comparison for ourselves.
Yes. Maybe it's a curiosity, but I enjoyed realizing when you were talking about Buddhism, the difference between Buddha with one D and two Ds.
Yes, yes, that's caused one of the arguments. Buddha with one D is the wisdom aspect. Yeah, and it's one of those books that has just the right title, but an unfortunate title because it confuses. It's the book by Sinnett, Esoteric Buddhism. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's, again, impossible to cover, but do you feel like mentioning something more specific about these traditions within, among themselves, and also within the context of theosophy and then East?
Well, I think the Greek teachings are possibly the most accessible to most people. And we can start with Plato, who regarded man as constituted of two parts, so to speak, not divided up, of course. One part eternal, and that part was formed of the same essence as the absolute, or absoluteness, or spirit, and the other mortal and corruptible. Now, the mortal and corruptible derives its constitution from what he called the various minor created gods, meaning the various forces and powers in nature. And these two parts, the mortal and the immortal, are not enough. They need something to bring them together. They need a separate, as he called it, a separate mortal kind of soul. And for that reason, Pythagoras referred to the soul as a self-moving unit. And of course, St. Paul taught the familiar threefold division.
Yes, indeed. Can I ask you here, before we comment some of these more Western contributions? So we speak about East and West. There's not so much mentioned when it comes to the Americas, at least here in this volume, or Africa.
Yeah, that is my limitation, Àlex. And not only that, I sort of regret's a strong word, but I wish. So it's the famous I wish. I could also have included the Scandinavian teachings, which are tremendous, the Odinic teachings. When you say the North American, South, I've mentioned that extensively in volume 1, but I haven't put it together in this sort of a table, which would be a very useful addition,
Yes.
addition to the next edition. Now, the African, I don't know. And if I don't know, I'm hardly going to say there isn't any. I'm sure there is. But the way to uncover it is through their mythology, their tradition. I would even say their songs, their art. And the other lack in that table is the great Islamic teaching.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, your honesty is commendable here, and we can only say, sure, we can only say we will keep learning. And if any of the listeners or readers knows more about this, well, he can come back to us and suggest what to study.
Love readers to send me something on the Scandinavian, the African, anything else that, and of course the Islamic.
Yes.
Islamic, the Sufi teachings, I've certainly read a lot about, but not in terms of the principles of man in that sense.
Yes. And well, you're really comprehensive. You're right. In volume 1, I don't recall exactly what chapter, but there was like a feast of traditions from all over the place.
Yes, displaying the mystery teachings.
The mystery teachings, yes. Yeah. Okay, so back to Western, and after Greeks, we find Gurdjieff.
Yes, Gurdjieff, he was steeped, if not steeped, he's certainly familiar with the Theosophical tradition and his famous pupil, Uspensky, of course. Again, each teacher provides a certain angle and a certain insight. Now, his famous saying that we are sleepwalking, my gosh, that's true. If we really were alive to every moment, our thought, our action, our behavior, if we were alive to every moment, we'd never say a stupid thing, let alone do a stupid thing. So the average person can, but does not yet possess this unified mind-body consciousness, and therefore lives in this sleepwalking state. But it is possible to transcend that state to a higher state of consciousness. And he identified, not surprisingly, 3 main centers in the human body: the intellectual, the middle emotional, and the higher spiritual. And Uspensky, of course, took this further in his fourth way teaching. And I was wondering, I was trying to research why fourth way, what's fourth about it? Well, in the sense that, as I understand it, all the great teachings talk of mind, body, and spirit. And it seems almost to be codified in that way. But the fourth way differs in that it has no permanent way, so to speak. It has no specific form or institutions, and it comes and goes controlled by the particular laws and state it dwells in. So it's like an overtone, if you like, a nuance. Mm-hmm. And that's another thing. I do admit that my section on Gurdjieff is not as complete as it could have been. And the Western teaching is just as important.
Well, in not even in defense of what you just said, in complement to what you just say, it is absolutely rich in pointers. I started writing down on a piece of paper as I was reading your chapters further books to look at, and I had to stop. And so, well, of course, you cannot find everything in there, but the references perhaps we emphasize this really towards the end, when we complete this journey and arrive at the end of volume 3, and maybe we discuss a bit of volume 4. But the synthesis and the collection of references that you provide is invaluable, because even if you felt, as it was my case, that this really resonates with one's spirit and you want to go further, as I was saying before, what do I know? Well, this kind of diluted New Age understanding of perhaps Alice Bailey, or I know a little bit of Rudolf Steiner here.
Yeah.
But here we have hundreds, if not thousands, of books that, by the way, you've read. Your library must be amazing. And here are pointers, so there's no excuse. It's full of well-ordered pointers.
Yeah, and my excuse for not being as full as I'd like to have been on Gurdjieff and Ouspensky is my intention is not to be that full, but to show that what is there is demonstrably in the literature. It can be verified independently. And insofar as it dovetails with the core occult teaching in those tables, as I've shown, well, my task is done. To that extent.
Yes.
And what you mentioned, Àlex, now is consilience, the convergence of independent or semi-independent bodies of knowledge that are maybe a bit weak on their own, but when they come together, they point towards a very definite teaching.
And probably they're not weak on their own either.
No,
they're super
not
strong.
Weak on their own. They're very, very super strong. Yeah, right. Yeah.
All right.
I'm talking as an absolute devil's advocate mystic there.
Yes.
Not skeptic, not mystic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Then you mentioned, of course, Ken Wilber.
Yes, Ken Wilber, right.
Monumental work of his.
Yes, absolutely. His integral philosophy. And again, he mentions the 4 quadrants, the sort of I, we, it, and they. And it's useful, I think, very often when one asks a question or in any situation to ask oneself, from which quadrant am I thinking and speaking?
Yes. Now to zoom out, and that's how you actually end this chapter, chapter 8. You have this beautiful image, very powerful, which is perennial philosophy. And then as that wisdom or that light goes through the prism of different contexts, different traditions, different times, different people, different bodies, different weathers, it scattered, naturally scattered. And then it comes, but I think it's your work, putting then a lens after that to make them all converge again and show that they have this common source.
If I could humbly ask readers to read, if they don't want to read that chapter, please at least read the last 2 pages, because they are certainly my favorite pages, if I can put it that way. And this is my inspiration from Leibniz, and I spent a lot of time, as some viewers might know, reading a lot of Newton, but also Leibniz. And here the most important point is I'm always striving to find a reconciling system of harmony. Now, that Leibniz diagram, as I put it, could apply not just to science, philosophy, but my goodness, it could apply to the ghastly political situation we see now, Ukraine and Russia, Israel and Palestine. So what Leibniz was saying is the commonest failing in us is the sectarian attitude, sectarian, narrow, my thoughts, my attitude, my this, my that, failing to see the wider picture. So the commonest failing is the sectarian spirit, where we diminish other people by rejecting in them what we fail to see in ourselves. And most philosophical schools are right largely in what they assert, but not so much in what they oppose and differ. So what Leibniz said, that since each side has a portion of the truth and fails to recognize what's in the other, what we don't do is add one bit of fact onto another, like building pieces of a jigsaw, but try and develop this reconciling framework of harmony.
Indeed, your great scholarship here, Eddie, is super helpful, because I have been searching for that particular quote of
Right.
Leibniz in that letter for years, because
really?
I had heard it glossed by a philosopher friend of mine, and I asked him many years ago, where is it? And he couldn't find it. But it sounded something like this, like everything you affirm is true. Everything you reject and negate is likely false. And that's my glossing of it. But now here it is in this chapter, fully quoted, and it's so puzzling to the intellect, but at the same time so natural, because basically how I read it is, if you are from looking at things from a certain position, and you always are,
Yes.
You can say what you see, and that's great. But if somebody says something else from their own position, but you don't see it because you're in your position, the temptation to say, no, that's not what I'm seeing, therefore what you're saying is wrong. This is the beginning of this sectarian attitude.
Of conflict, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
But there's no suggestion in that you should agree with everyone and say yes to everything. Not at all. The system of harmony is such that we maximize the not the lowest common denominator, but the highest common factor.
Now, why do you say now towards the end, and by the way, these pages is 188, 89, and 90. I just check it out. For the reader, just go there. Why do you say that Leibniz was a networker?
Well, because exactly because of this attitude of his, he wanted to harmonize all the great philosophical traditions. And I'm sure if the great Newton had been a bit more forthcoming, that unfortunate episode would not have occurred. But that apart, I believe his whole approach was to draw together all the great philosophers. And my goodness, when you read what Leibniz got up to, he was a tremendous historian. He was obviously a great alchemist, a writer, a philosopher. His doctrine on monadology. He was also a great geologist. He discovered he knew how to extract phosphorus. A total polymath in every sense. Yes. And I would like to see Leibniz's great thoughts given more importance, and not just put in either in intellectual quarantine, or in an intellectual sort of silo only for intellectuals.
Indeed, yeah. This history is full of projections onto one dimension of all these incredible sages. Yes. Okay, should we move to the coda of volume 2?
Absolutely, yeah.
And that has an interesting title as a simile, which is about how to construct and energize this divine temple. That's our body, our bodies. Yes.
So it's really the construction is based on the previous chapters, really, that of constitution and nature. Constitution is how we are built up, our structure, and I used the analogy with a house or a temple, if you like, and the energizing is electricity from a power station.
Yes.
But, sorry, go on.
No. So, how can we think this electricity more concretely? And what are these power stations? And also, well, we can discuss this after you answer this. But I was very intrigued, and also I nodded. I say, sure. When you mentioned that if those power stations are not correctly ordered again, not only can you have too little energy, but maybe you can have too much, and that brings ill health. So it's again, this is a serious business. This is not, oh, how cool, let's be spiritual and let's receive. No. You can get electrocuted.
You
Perhaps
can easily get electrocuted. Yes, I can certainly develop on that. That I was using the analogy or the warning given by, can you see, Yogananda?
Yes.
And where he was talking of Kriya Yoga, the yoga of the mind, and pointing out that any spiritual practice, whether it's Kriya Yoga or even more powerfully Kundalini, which people fool around with to my horror, any spiritual practice will energize your inner being. And when you energize the inner being, the physical vehicle has got to be able to take the higher voltage, the high energy that's coursing through the body. So in the most crude sense, if you get a Ferrari engine and put it in a Mini, the chassis is just going to take that extra power. If you want to drive a Ferrari engine, you've got to put it in a proper chassis, in a stronger chassis. So the whole point of Hatha Yoga has nothing to do with looking beautiful and all the rest. Well, you will do, but as a byproduct. But the whole point is so that the physical body develops the extra stability, energy, and robustness to withstand the higher energies that are flowing through it as a result of your spiritual practice and your Kriya Yoga.
This is so important, so hardly mentioned, especially when we consume these diluted forms of spirituality, because we think is, well, we'll do some work, not very hard, by the way, and then the thing will come. But if it came, it could destroy us. So
very simply, if I start playing with some of the advanced etudes of Chopin and Liszt without developing the technique, I will ruin my fingers. Yeah, it's just, because that is high voltage piano playing. So if my technique isn't good enough, it's no fault of Liszt and Chopin. It's my stupidity. I should develop the technique first.
Yes.
Same principle.
Yes.
If an athlete doesn't warm up, he'll hurt his legs. Same principle.
So this is a reminder of the crucial importance of the physical body in all these matters.
Crucial. Absolutely. Yes. As a temple.
Yes, as a temple.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the glue that joins?
The glue, yes. I've talked about glue and araldite, yes.
Yes.
This is a vital teaching. What it's saying is this, that I'll put the occult thing first, that the immortal, the higher self, is the triplicity, Atma, Buddhi, Manas, the divine self, the intuitional principle, and the higher mind, and the lower quaternary. And what a surprise that quaternary means four. What a surprise that the cross is always a symbol of matter. So the lower quaternary is physical body, the model body, prana, the vitality, and desire. Now, what it's saying is you can't just have the higher and the lower coming together, because that would be, for example, in a university, you can't have the professor and the student coming together and you get your degree. You don't. You need the lecturers in between. The in-between, the interface, is that soul, S-O-U-L principle, the generic principle. Another simplistic thing, in a car factory, you can have the vision of the designer, but that together with the shop floor workers won't produce a car. You need the management to interface between the two. So what provides the interface in the human being, the glue, is kama manas, lower mind and desire. That's the pivot which holds together the higher nature and the lower. So without that glue, you can have the most wonderful professor in your university, reverting to that example. You can have the most wonderful students, but the two won't see eye to eye. Unless you have wonderful lecturers, and the lecturer as always, will interface with the professor, the higher, and the students lower. I don't mean high and lower in a judgmental sense, of course.
Yes.
So that is the glue. That's the vital glue.
So in the same way that we found an honorable place for the lower floor being the body, the physical body, here we find a very honorable role for this intermediate.
Most certainly. And the glue has two components, desire and thought. Like any glue on earth has the solvent and the hardener, you know.
Yes.
Cake or cement has got the cement and the water.
Yes.
So you always have two things coming together to make the glue, as above, so below.
Yes.
You'll never find a glue with just one thing, one chemical.
Yes. You also mentioned, and I like this expression, scientific allies. Sorry, my English is not allies. Scientific allies. Yes.
Yeah.
In all these, specifically Schrödinger, of course, and Sherrington.
Sherrington, Sir Charles Sherrington, yes. Modern science is our best ally.
You know, if they had told us when I was studying physics in university, when I was studying quantum mechanics, and they present to us the Schrödinger equation, if they could have made a footnote and say, by the way, Schrödinger got it. He was aware that Atman is Brahman.
Yes. The individual self is the all-comprehending universal self, which is far from blasphemous, but the deepest statement of Indian thought, he said.
Yes.
And then we talked about blood transfusion last time.
Yes.
Schrödinger said we don't want to lose Western science and precision, but we need blood transfusion from the East, but not too rapidly, otherwise we get blood clots.
Yeah, again, a proper tempo.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, is there anything else you wish to mention about the coda? Just to reinforce here, or to remark that the absolute centrality in this journey through volume 2 of the constitution of man, and also the implications this has for immortality. I think these are the highlights of the teachings in volume 2.
So I would say my central purpose and message is coming back to the great Leibniz, that you can't possibly be sectarian in your attitudes and approach the perennial philosophy or occult philosophy. On the other hand, when you enter the sacred precincts of the perennial philosophy, you will shed your dogmatism and your narrow outlook when you see that universal thread connecting everything. So what I would say, it is so important always to stand in the center of the circle, because when you're in the center, you can go along any radius and come back along the radius and you're still at the center of the circle.
And this image is useful to connect it to what's coming in volume 3, right? Because this has been perhaps looking inwards. And actually, if I recall correctly, you used the microscope metaphor
that's right.
for volume 2, and then the telescope for volume 3. Because now what's coming is, well, given that constitution of man, what's its role outwards and towards the cosmos and nature?
Yes. Having seen our relation and relationship with fellow human beings and all of nature, we can extend that and look outwards.
Do you want to anticipate something of what's coming in volume 3 at this point, or should we leave it for when we're there?
Well, I would say, Àlex, the most important and the most difficult chapter, or semi-difficult, let's say, deals with this whole question of experience, that as long as we shed the notion that the brain generates consciousness, the whole nature of experience is not easily, but becomes clarified. So the nature of experience is, and the divine forces in the human being and how that relates to the universe. Man, the measure of all things. Man, the measure of all things.
Yes, a lot to discuss there, and also
And
to
symbolism. And symbolism.
well, you see, all of those aspects you're mentioning and need to be cleansed from distortions, eh?
Yes.
Because we've been told so much, well, symbolism, or that saying that man is the measure of all things is both perhaps misogynistic and also anthropocentric, and that's precisely what we need to avoid. But here we are seeing it from this truly potent light.
Yes, man, the human principle that has come to being as a result of divine forces, is therefore the measure of all things.
Is it as this is perhaps a weird irony in all of this? I realize this just occurred to me, so I'll just share it. That all these deep truths, really, really deep truths, when they're presented, they're coded with a like if you wish, with some sort of wrapping that actually seems to convey the opposite. It's like as if they were hidden to convey the opposite, and just try that you don't look further. Because you could imagine, let me unfold this a bit more. Sure. You could imagine, well, this is this big truth, deep truth, but of course you won't be able to just absorb it directly because it's inside. So what you get at the surface is kind of diluted. But sometimes it seems that we're given the opposite message of what the thing is.
I see what you're saying, Àlex, and what just comes to mind thinking aloud is sometimes the opposite is given to protect the truth from prying eyes who are not ready to receive it. Now, that sounds very patronizing. So those who really want the truth will see through the opposite. That is one thing that comes to mind. The other, it could just be a question of language and presentation.
Yeah. Maybe it's by chance that it happened. I was just observing a pattern in my own experience encountering these things. Because, as I was saying, often when I'm reading your book, I smile and I think, wow, so if this really means that, how come my first encounter with it was precisely a diluted version multiplied by -1, kind of the opposite understanding? And that happens systematically. And so I wonder, well, is there any trickery there, cosmical or just by chance, so that we don't get immediately into those?
Well, we always must and have to put anything new into our existing framework, So as long as we recognize we are in our Plato's cave, we can't demolish the cave, but we can certainly widen the cave.
Yes. Yeah, well, thank you, Eddie, for showing us all these stances in the cave with the torch.
It's a great privilege. The honor is mine.
It's mine, really. By the way, do you want to mention, perhaps briefly, we have a few more minutes, of course.
Yeah, sure.
There are 3 appendices.
Yes.
Do you want to say something about each of them? They're brief, but not because they're brief. We shouldn't say anything about them because they're really interesting. The 3 of them.
Right. The first one is a development of the central teaching of the Antakarana, which is the spiritual umbilical connection between the higher self and the lower. I use the example of the parent and the child. If the parent loses control of the child, there is mayhem. The Antakarana explains so much of what we see around us, the so-called evil, and also the so-called genius. The greater that umbilical connection is strengthened, the more the current from the higher self can energize that lower self. The second appendix deals with this thorny question of ether, which was discarded by physics as a result of the Michelson-Morley experiment. But the ether is central to occult science in the sense that the ether, A-E-T-H-E-R, or akasha, if you like, is that subtle womb that is the container of all that is and was, that Owen Laszlo puts it so beautifully. And the ether is, if you like, just the lining of that, the lowest level of that. But this ether dichotomy arose because even with James Clerk Maxwell and the great physicist then reasoned that just as sound needs sound waves, so light must need light waves, sort of fairly logical. Until Michelson-Morley showed that light is a self-propagating wave and it doesn't need an ether. But the Michelson-Morley experiment was conducted over a few days with a few hundred turns of the interferometer, the optical device, whereas Dayton Miller, a senior scientist, physicist, head of the American Physical Society, he conducted experiments not just over a few days, but 25 years, involving several 100,000 turns of the interferometer. And he certainly was able to discover the ether and to show that it varies according to temperature and altitude. But all of this was sidelined because the ether completely cut against Einstein's special theory of relativity. So one had to win the day, so to speak. But again, it wasn't Einstein who entered the fray, the argument. It was Robert Shanklin, one of his admirers, let's say, who after Dayton Miller's death completely, if not destroyed, locked away his findings. But incredibly, Einstein, in his own talk to the University of Leiden, said, in his talk in German, he said, I'd say it in English, of course, the concept of general relativity without an ether is unthinkable. We need an ether, but it's not the ponderable ether of the Victorians. So the ether is central, and I've produced, or I've listed, I don't know, 30 or 40 papers that show just this. And I think science should revisit that. The third appendix is all to do with freedom of thought, which is central to the Theosophical Society, that no teacher, including Blavatsky, has any right to impose a teaching. And whenever you have fundamentalism, then you have a state of stagnation. But the trouble is when a teacher is so powerful and iconic, like Blavatsky, people tend to look on her as the ultimate, even though she so openly said, I'm not the ultimate. But enshrined in the Theosophical Society is, in their resolutions, is the freedom of inquiry. And I think the last quote in that appendix is from the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna saying, by whichever path a man approaches me, I am there. So come to me by the Christian path, the Muslim path, ever, I am there. Because the path is pointing to me, the divine source, Krishna, Christos, Krishna and Christos.
Amen, as we say in Spanish. Amen.
Thank you.
Wonderful, Eddie. Fantastic. Thank you so much for having written these volumes and for patiently walking through them with us.
It's been my pleasure and privilege, Àlex. I've learned a lot as well from your very insightful questions and your wonderful responses. I really mean that. Thank you, Àlex.
Thank you, and see you soon. And we are going to enter into volume 3, indeed.
That's right. All right.
Until then.
Think of it as the 3 pyramids, the third pyramid. That's the Grand Pyramid.
All right.
All right.
Till then. Bye-bye.
See you soon. Thank you.